So what I want to do is pose a two-horn dilemma for Epicurean views. That's the goal of this paper. So on the first horn, Epicurean views sometimes try to say, our view's not as radically counterintuitive as you think. It can accommodate common sense reasons we have to seek or avoid our death. They want to say the reasons that we have to seek or avoid our death are essentially the same as the deprivation is. So even though your death isn't bad for you, you should avoid your death if it prevents you from living a long and happy life. And you should seek death if it's going to prevent you from suffering endlessly. Now, on the first one, I want to say that those Epicurean views are involved in what's called a mere verbal dispute with deprivation views. So the idea is Epicurean views modified to accommodate common sense assumptions about when we should seek or avoid death aren't going to be saying anything that's really different from deprivation views. They're going to be saying the same thing, just using different terminology. On the second horn, I want to target Epicurean views that don't try to accommodate common sense assumptions about the reasons we have to seek or avoid death. And those Epicurean views, I want to claim, are absurd. They're subject to a reductio argument, so we should just reject them. So the idea is Epicurean views are either false, or they're just saying the same thing as deprivation views about madness. Okay. So here's how this talk's going to go. In the next section, I'm going to provide two cases which illustrate a desideratum for any plausible account of death. Then after that, I want to briefly review how almost all contemporary Epicureans and deprivation views handle the two cases in question. And then in the fourth section, we're going to discuss what it means for a disagreement to be merely verbal, or for two views to be trivially distinct from one another. And then after doing that, I want to argue that the contemporary Epicurean views that I focus on in the standard deprivation views are involved in a merely verbal dispute. Okay. So here's what I think is an essential desideratum for any plausible account of death. An agent's self-regarding reasons for avoiding or seeking death are, at least in part, determined by how well the agent's life would go were she to not die at the time in question. This desideratum is needed to account for the seemingly correct verdicts in the following two cases. So the first case, I'm just following Aaron Smuts, and I'm drawing from the modern classic film No Country for Men. So it's not plagiarism, just reference it. So I call it the coin toss. The convenience store Carl clerk crosses paths with psychopathic hitman Anton, and he offers Carl the following deal. He's going to flip a coin. If the coin lands on heads, then Carl will receive a satchel filled with $2 million in cash. We can say Carl would use this $2 million of cash to get things that he wants, things which make him happy. I'll just stipulate that if Carl gets the $2 million in cash, he'll live a long and happy life spending that money. Okay. Now, if it lands on tails, Anton will quickly and painlessly murder Carl. So the process of dying won't be bad for Carl. He's not going to feel a thing. It's going to be very quick. He's not even going to know that it happens. And I'll stipulate Carl is a hermit. If he's murdered, nobody will mourn his loss. But he's a good person, and he enjoys his life. It's not like he deserves to die or anything like that. Okay. Now, setting aside the question of whether death would harm Carl, forget that for a moment. Any plausible account of death should allow that it's in Carl's interest, in his more weakly, his self-regarding reason, to hope that the coin lands on heads, and he gets $2 million of cash. Whether or not it's harmful for him, he should desire that the coin lands on heads. His life will be much longer and contain more good than it does if the coin lands on tails. And after all, a longer, happier life is better than a short, less happy life. Better for Carl. Now, I think this much is uncontroversial, more or less. At least most contemporary Epicureans want to accept that. They want to accommodate this. Okay. Now, just as the prospect of continued pleasurable existence should provide one with reason to continue living, the prospect of miserable existence should provide one with reason to end one's life. At least self-regarding reason. Not necessarily all reason, all things considered. But I'm assuming in these cases, people don't have obligations to anybody else, there's not people that rely on them. The only reasons that they're going to have to seek or avoid death are going to be self-regarding. Okay. So, second case, torturing the spy. Sage, the spy has been captured and is about to undergo years of constant torture, followed only by death. Now, Sage can avoid such a fate if and only if she bites down on the cyanide capsule that she has hidden on her right now. So, there's no way out of it. It's just stipulating that what would happen if she doesn't take the cyanide capsule is that she's just going to be tortured for the rest of her natural life. There'll be no pleasure in her life, just constant suffering until she dies. Very sad. There's no way she can get out of it. Now, the only way she can avoid experiencing such torture is biting down on the cyanide capsule, and then she'll quickly and painlessly die. Okay, so setting aside the question of whether Sage's death would be good for her, forget that for a moment. It seems clear that Sage has strong self-regarding reason to painlessly end her life by biting down on the cyanide capsule. The reason being that only by doing so will Sage prevent herself from suffering years of constant torture. And after all, a shorter life with less misery is better than a longer life that contains only misery with the extra amount of time. Okay, so those are the two cases. What I think are the correct responses to those two cases provide good reason for us to accept this desideratum for any possible death. Now I want to talk about what deprivationists and Epicureans can say about these two cases. Now, deprivation views have a pretty easy natural response to these. They're in a perfect position to accommodate the desideratum. After all, according to the deprivationalists, the badness or goodness of one's death is determined by how one's life would go in the nearest possible world where the individual did not die of time in question. So long as people have self-regarding reason to seek things that are good for them, and self-regarding reason to avoid things that are bad for them, deprivation views are in a perfect position to handle these two cases. Now, at this point, Epicureanism might appear to be a non-starter, since they hold that death cannot harm or benefit the person who dies. But that would be too quick. Almost all contemporary Epicureans try to avoid the potentially radically counterintuitive implications of the view by arguing that the reasons a person has to seek or avoid death don't differ from common sense. And they do this to appeal to the aforementioned desideratum. So contemporary Epicureans will say, sometimes you have reasons, self-regarding reasons, to avoid death, even if it's not going to harm you. Sometimes you have self-regarding reasons to seek death, even if it's not good for you. Okay. Now, in doing so, they also implicitly assume comparativism. Not all of them, they don't outright accept this claim, but most of them seem to at least implicitly assume this, which I formulate in a way that's neutral between Epicurean views and deprivation views, as follows. For any person S has self-regarding reason to bring about or avoid an event E, if and only if, and to the extent that S's total net receipt of intrinsic goods over intrinsic evils would have been greater or smaller if E not occurred. Okay. Now, to be sure, Epicureans don't need to adopt comparativism in order to generate intuitively correct verdicts in the aforementioned cases. But they do need to at least allow that agents have reasons, self-regarding reasons, to prefer a continued happy life over the permanent cessation of existence. And they should have reason to prefer the permanent cessation of their existence over a life of pure and constant misery. Okay. So now I want to look at particular contemporary Epicurean views that handle these two cases. They're not exhaustive, but I think they are representative. And even if they're not, I want to argue that Epicurean views unable to accommodate the essential desideratum should be rejected. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is James Stacy Taylor's view, and he draws a distinction between harms for a person and harms to a person. And harms to persons affect the well-being. From the examples he gives, he seems to have in mind things that are intrinsically bad to persons. Although it's not clear that he thinks that's a constitutive condition. Harms for persons do not affect the well-being but prevent the existence of a self-regarding state of affairs that the person values independently of her well-being. So this allows for intrinsic harms, notably the state of affairs. The event that is harmful for P prevents from obtaining is one where P had a better life than P actually did, which is where the comparativism seems to come in. So in the coin toss, death would not be a harm to Carl, but it would be a harm for Carl. Why? Because in the nearest possible world in which Carl doesn't die is one where he lives a long and happy life. Carl's death prevents the existence of such a state of affairs, and Carl has self-regarding reason to die. In Torture of the Spy, similar results obtained. Sage's death would not be good to Sage. She can't experience said good, but it would be good for Sage, since it prevents the state of affairs and Sage has self-regarding reason to disvalue. Namely, a state of affairs where she exists, but just suffers and doesn't go into pleasure. So, Taylor can say that we have strong reasons to avoid her death, even though death does not harm the deceased. Could be a harm for you, though. Stephen Rosenbaum, his is an interesting case. He allows that being dead can be bad, simpliciter, not necessarily bad for anyone. But although he denies that being dead can be bad for the deceased, he wants to allow that death itself can be bad for the deceased, and he understands death as the moment where you switch from the process of dying to being dead. Okay, so then this entails that we can have self-regarding reasons to avoid death, because that can harm you. Being dead can harm you in his view, but death can harm the deceased. O.H. Green distinguishes between what he calls objective evils and subjective evils. It seems to be a kind of unique way between distinguishing between these, but on his view, objective evils are those that impede normal functioning, and subjective evils require affecting consciousness. So Green defends Epicureanism by restricting its scope to subjective evils, rendering the view practically tautological. On Green's Epicureanism, death can still be bad or good for the deceased. It just must be an event that is objectively bad or good for the deceased, rather than subjectively bad or good for the deceased. Because it doesn't affect the consciousness. In some ways, it doesn't make the consciousness go out of existence, but it's not something that the person can experience. And that's what he seems to have in mind when he talks about consciousness. Okay, Aaron Smuts makes a distinction between less good and bad for. And while death can never be bad for the deceased, it can cause the agent to obtain less good, and should be avoided for that reason. So, in the coin toss case, Carl has reason to desire that he doesn't die. Not because it'd be bad for him, because it wouldn't be anything that he could experience, it wouldn't be anything that would be painful, but it would cause him to obtain less good in his life than would happen if he died. And that can give him reason to care about his death and avoid it. Similarly, in the spy case, Sage's death would cause her to obtain a higher overall level of well-being, and it would not necessarily be more good, but it would prevent her from obtaining more bad, and presumably, on Smuts' view, should be sought for that reason. Okay, and finally, Stephen Hetherington's view. That one's a little more complicated. It's not clear whether his view can meet the desideratum of death, but whether or not it does, it's still subject to the two-point dilemma. So in his view, he seems to think that we have reason to avoid death whenever the possible death would happen before ataraxia. Hope that I'm not mispronouncing that. Which is a pervasive inner peace, that's a kind of purity and completeness in how one is living. And is something that Epicurus himself actually seemed to be concerned with. So in Hetherington's view, death is not what is bad for the deceased, but living a life that never reaches ataraxia is bad for the deceased. And presumably, whether one has reason to seek or avoid death depends upon whether or not they would achieve ataraxia if they didn't die at the time in question. But I'll talk about that more at the very end. Okay. Now I want to talk about what a mere verbal dispute is, and then I'll go into a little more detail how these views, these particular Epicurean views, are involved in a mere verbal dispute, deprivation views. All right. Now, philosophers, a long time, have claimed that disagreements are often just matters of mere verbal disputes without kind of saying what a mere verbal dispute is. Recent work in meta-philosophy has started to change that, however, and I want to focus on a couple of accounts that are plausible or heuristic for picking out mere verbal disputes. They're not picking out the constitutive conditions for being involved in a mere verbal dispute. They should provide a sufficient condition, and generally, if these conditions are met, should give us reason to think that two views are involved in a mere verbal dispute. Okay. In his 2005, Eli Hirsch suggests that a debate amounts to nothing more than a merely verbal disagreement, if and only if the members of each side of the debate can interpret the other side as stating the truths about the subject in their own language. Now, you can formulate his view more precisely as follows, and this is kind of what David Chalmers does in this 2011 photo review paper. So two parties A and B are having a merely verbal dispute if and only if were A and B to inhabit an A community and a B community, respectively, in which everyone exhibits the same sort of linguistic behavior that A and B actually exhibit, respectively. Then on the correct view of linguistic interpretation, A and B would agree that both the speakers speak the truth in language. I think this is plausibly read as a sufficient condition for being involved in a merely verbal dispute. David Chalmers notes that there are some cases, problematic cases of this, stemming from sorts of semantic externalism, cases where it renders the wrong verdict about questions about whether somebody is tall or short, if semantic externalism is true and there's a kind of epistemic vagueness. Now, we don't have to get into that, that's a tangential issue because it's not a type of issue that applies to the Epicurean deprivation debate. And at any rate, David Chalmers gives a broader account of merely verbal disputes, which will suffice for the purposes of my argument. So on the broad version, the dispute over S is broadly verbal when for some expression T and S, parties disagree about the meaning of T, and the dispute over S arises wholly in virtue of this disagreement regarding T. Okay. So now we're in a better position to see why most contemporary Epicureans and deprivationalists are involved in a merely verbal dispute. So take S to refer to the debate over whether death harms the deceased, and T to refer to the meaning of harm to a person or harm for a person or harm a person. Now, as noted in section 3 on standard deprivation views, whether death is a harm for a person is determined by what would happen to the person if she did not die at the time in question. So, on their view, an event E harms by definition if and only if, or sorry, harms P by definition if and only if E results in a net decrease of P's receipt of intrinsic goods. Now, I've stated deprivation views a bit oversimplistically so far. Deprivation, it's not like there's just one deprivation view and they all agree about what the intrinsic goods are. Deprivation views can be further individuated by what counts as intrinsic goods. So you can supplement a deprivation view with an account of well-being, and that's going to be substantially different from other deprivation views. Okay. So I'm not claiming that all deprivation views are involved in a mere verbal dispute with all views. Okay. Now, for Epicureans, an event E can harm P by definition if and only if P can, in principle, experience E. Yet, at the same time, in order to accommodate the aforementioned desideratum, they accept that agents have self-regretted reason to avoid or seek death, if avoiding or seeking death at the time in question would result in a net increase or decrease in the agent's receipt of intrinsic goods. So, to recap, deprivationists seem to just be using the term harm to refer to events that result in an overall decrease of the agent's receipt of intrinsic goods. And Epicureans use harm more narrowly. They use harm to refer to events that that are bad for the agent that the agent can in principle experience. And then they use a different term to refer to other things that result, other events that result in a decrease of an agent's receipt of intrinsic goods. Okay. So in Taylor's view, we can just substitute harm with harm to or harm for. So he's just making the distinction that deprivation views don't make, but could if they wanted to. So Taylor's view, an event E is a harm to or for P if and only if E results in a net decrease of P's received intrinsic goods. For Green, an event E is a subjective or objective harm for P if and only if E results in a net decrease of P's received intrinsic goods. And again, deprivation views can make this distinction between subjective and objective harms if they want to. It would just be a distinction between harms that affect a person while they're alive and harms that affect a person while they're not, or harms that a person can experience and harms that a person will not experience. On Smuts' view, an event E is less good or bad for P if and only if E results in a net decrease of P's received intrinsic goods. So for each of these views, you can plug in this disjunctive claim about what affects an agent's received intrinsic goods, and that will be used or can be substituted for deprivation's use of the term harm. And, crucially, deprivation views can adopt the distinction that these Epicureans are making if they want between extrinsic and intrinsic harms, experiential, non-experiential harms, whatever distinctions you want to draw, harms that happen at a time a person exists, harms that happen at a time a person does not exist. They just don't draw that distinction when they're talking about what harms are. Okay, now we get to ones that are a bit more complicated. Rosenbaum is unclear. For him, an event E seems like should, sorry, I think there's an is, that should not be on the handout. An event E should, for self-interested reasons, be avoided by P if and only if E results in a net decrease of P's received intrinsic goods. Now, his concept of well-being is a bit unclear to me, and his understanding of the relationship between an agent's well-being and self-regarded reasons for action is also unclear. But he seems to think that harmful events are those that are intrinsically bad, and he can allow events which are extrinsically bad in the non-standard sense of harm. So, although being dead is neither extrinsically nor intrinsically bad, death is extrinsically bad. Hetherington's view is a bit more complicated. So you give the same translation that I did for Rosenbaum, but it's not clear whether achieving ataraxia counts as an intrinsic good. I think it must count as an intrinsic good on his view. It must make the agent better off than the agent would have otherwise been. And if that's the case, we can ask this further question for his view. Should one avoid death even if they would not or could not achieve ataraxia were they to live? So, suppose an agent dies before achieving ataraxia. And Hetherington can say, that can be bad because they didn't achieve ataraxia. We can say, should they avoid death if they would have achieved ataraxia if they did that time in question? And if this answer is yes, then it seems to be trivially distinct from a, I think, false deprivation, but nevertheless trivially distinct from a false deprivation. One where an account of well-being includes achieving ataraxia. Because you should avoid death, because if you did die at the time in question, you would achieve something that makes you better off. That's just to be the deprivation most people want to make. If whether or not you achieve something that's intrinsically good for you has no effect on whether you have reasons to seek or avoid death, on Hetherington's view, if he says no to my question, then the view seems to be false. You can't account for the aforementioned consideration. Right. So even though he doesn't specify a concept of well-being, I think we can still subject his view to the two-point dilemma. That's it all. At least we have comments. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for the great work putting this whole thing together, and to Travis for getting me to think a lot more about these really interesting ideas about the value of death. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to read the text, and also the presentation. In this this article, what Travis Michael Timmerman is trying to prove is that once we see the ways in which a deprivationist and Epicurean theory of the value of death plays an essential desideratum that every account of that subject will face, it is easy to see how, given a reasonable account of verbal dispute, the conflict between the two is merely verbal, and then it should be discarded so we can focus on other problems about death. I think this strategy is valuable for two main reasons. On the one hand, by introducing the desideratum, he gives us a useful way to make clear what exactly is at stake about the way we value death and the reasons involved in that matter. On the other hand, he takes an original position to paint a long-standing debate between, and when he uses his argument to prove that the conflict between the two positions is ultimately a purely verbal disagreement. However, I have two big comments about the Epicurean position that can be relevant to the argument. So, my first comment. First, I would like to discuss the idea behind the desideratum presented in the second section by two particular cases. The way I see it, the two cases are intended to show how our intuitions would lead us to think that there are situations where we have reason to avoid or seek death, and a good moral theory about the subject will have to take into account this phenomenon. If that is the case, then it seems that the arguments rest on the non-explicit premise that a satisfactory moral theory must take into account our moral intuitions in particular cases, like the ones in the examples. Furthermore, in the two examples, there's the certainty that the agents have about how the rest of their life is going to be appears to be a central element, because if they did not knew that a considerable amount of pleasure or complete misery awaits them, then neither conversation will take the attitude they're supposedly to. Okay? Now, one of the most significant elements of the Epicurean theory is that it is intended as a practical theory. According to Lucretius, humans are commonly immersed in ignorance, which prevents them from living their lives properly, and once they see things clearly, they will stop suffering. In the case of death, we can stop worrying about it once we discover that nothing about it can be bad for us. Considering that certainty is not an element that could be considered practical easily, since it's very difficult to find ourselves in our ordinary lives in a situation like the one in the examples, and the principle of Epicureanism is to have a practical incident, then there is an important element in conflict between the desiderata and the Epicurean theory. If to this last argument one responds that the desideratum has independent reasons to be held against Epicureanism, like that it goes according to our intuitions, then she should have to offer reasons to the Epicureans for favoring the principle that said that you have to take into account those intuitions instead of the practical principle fundamental for their philosophy. And our response is that someone defending the desideratum can still have a point by saying that even if the examples are not a common case, they are indeed plausible, and Epicureans just explain what is happening there. There could be a really strong answer to this, like saying that the examples are misleading and they are not really practically plausible, or that the intuitions are wrong and there are no reasons involved. But I think a much reasonable way of answering is that the reasons involved in the examples are not just common reasons, and that is precisely what my second point is about. But before that, just a small comment. By the end of the article, Timmerman said that once we see the problem is a merely verbal one, we should concentrate in other debates, like the appropriate attitude towards it, and knowing the problem of the value of it. But the Epicureans will argue that the root of this later is precisely the former, since, as I know, according to them, we are miserable thinking about the day when we are going to die because we think that is something that can harm us. So, my second point. I want to point out a problem I found in the final argumentation about the conflict between the two theories being merely verbal. When Timmerman is comparing the way in which both theories define harm, he says the following, and here's the quote. Epicureans, on the other hand, use harm to a person to refer to an event that a person can in principle experience. At the same time, to accommodate the desideratum in section 2, they accept that agents have self-regarding reason to avoid or seek death, if avoiding death at the time in question will result in an increase or decrease in that agent's receipt of intrinsic good. Once they supplement their Epicureanism with this claim about reasons, they have reduced the argument against deprivationists to a merely verbal dispute. Well, there's a lot to say about this passage. First, it is not entirely clear that Epicureans will hold it. Harm to a person must be something that she can experience. As Geoffrey Scare points out, here's the other quote. Epicurean is not the unlikely proposition that all evil is experienced, but the much more credible one that all evil requires is an existent subject. Epicurus' consolation for morality rests squarely on what Fred Goldman has termed the existence condition, that nothing either good or bad can happen to a subject S at the time t unless S exists at t. If somebody is curious about why it's unlikely that the Epicurean is holding this, is because we have cases where we can be harmed even if we're not experiencing something. Like, for example, when somebody's talking in our back, something bad about us, well, we can say that this is not something bad, but we're not experiencing anything. So, having clarified this point, we see that what the Epicurean is doing, what he's doing when he accepts that we have reason to avoid that is not only conceding a point to the deprivationist or supplementing her theory, but what she's doing so according to the existing conditions, which is an important Epicurean claim. Note that even if this claim depends on our intuitions about the difference between our way of valuing something for an existing subject and our way of valuing something like that, it does not conflict with my first point about our moral intuitions in particular cases. This is so because I do not hold that an Epicurean should reject the principle that says that the theory must take into account our intuitions, but just that without an special reason for it, he does not have to favor it instead of with some principle of applicability in practice. Okay. So, even if they accept that agents have surrogate reasons to avoid death, those reasons cannot be the same kind of the ones we have to avoid harm, because that is something that just makes sense with an existing subject. Then, if there is any negative or positive value of death, it must be at least in that way different from what we normally would call value according to the Epicureans. I'm sorry, I think I missed. It is not difficult to see Feldman's existing condition at work in the relevant examples of Epicurean theories that Timmerman uses. When Rosenbaum holds that death is bad in itself and Green that it is an objective evil, they are trying to eliminate the way an existing subject can figure in an explanation of the value of it. We can see this even in Taylor's distinction between harm for and to, since the former cannot affect well-being because that is an ordinary way of talking, valuing things in a negative way, and it depends on an existing subject. Okay, I made a small comment here. It is interesting to note that if this is correct and Taylor subscribes the existing condition, then there is a problem with the affirmation that he is assuming some kind of comparativism like Timmerman holds. There is nothing to compare between the two hypothetical situations since they are essentially different in the way we value them. So, here's my dilemma. In the light of this, an Epicurean can present two options to the deprivations, whether to accept or not the distinction between the two ways of valuing. Here it's important to note that I speak of two different kinds of value loosely because I don't want to compromise myself with an explanation of the relationship between them, whether it is of subordination or of independence. But I think that if an Epicurean is choosing an independence relationship, then he must affirm that in some important way that classification is empty, because otherwise he will go against the existence condition. In the light of this, an Epicurean can present in the case of him not accepting it, then the conflict between the two theories will not be merely verbal, because the debate that lies behind is the one between pluralism and monism of value, which is a substantial discussion in moral philosophy. On the other hand, if he accepts the distinction, he has two other options. First, it might be that the problem that the deprivationist has with the Epicurean is about the kind of value that we attribute when there is not an existing subject. And in that case, I agree that the conflict will be merely verbal because both proponents are only discussing the meaning of harm when they both accept similar conditions for something different as that. The problem with taking this position is that since the reason why we separate the two types of value is an essential condition of Epicureanism, then contrary to what the title of the article suggests, the only plausible forms of deprivationism are, at least in this point, Epicureans in disguise. But the deprivationist could take another option and claim that his conflict with the other way we value things with an existing subject involved. In this case, Epicurean has the existing condition to defend that in this case that of death we are actually dealing with the other way of valuing, and then the conflict is, again, not merely verbal, but instead about the best way to understand moral evaluations in the matter of death. Now the conclusion. If Timmerman agrees that the best alternative for the deprivation is to grant the Epicurean herb distinction and take the first option. Then he could maintain his conclusion that the conflict between the two is merely verbal, but that will change his initial position about Epicureanism. However, if he believes that this is not the best alternative, then he must say something more about the relationship between his argument of merely verbal disputes, the Epicurean existence principle, and the debate between the pluralist and monism of thought. And that's my reply.
Thank you. Would you like to reply to Blue?
I would, yeah. So first I'd like to thank Rodrigo for his very helpful comments, helping me clarify my thinking about this issue, and it's going to help me improve the paper. I wrote a few comments up yesterday, so I don't have them memorized yet, so I'm going to have to read them. So I apologize for that, but hopefully there's something important going on in there. So I'm just going to take it bit by bit and then try to respond to the inputs you make. Bearing in mind that I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about them as I reread the paper. Okay, so with respect to the claim about assuming that a satisfactory account must take in depth must consider our moral intuitions in particular cases like the ones I give. Yeah, I mean, I think I phrased it a bit forcefully, but I do think that any view about the badness of death should have something to say about our intuitive responses to these cases. So I think they should either at least be able to account for the intuitively correct verdicts or give us some kind of debunking explanation about why our intuitions in that case are unreliable. And that could take the form of a more kind of general debunking of our intuitions about first order normative judgments. That being said, I also think that you can get the same kind of intuitive force with principles that don't rely on our intuitions about first order normative judgments. It's just more boring to do that if you can give a case where somebody's life is on the line. It's a little more fun to talk about. But I mean, I think the principle P has most self-regarding reason to choose non-existence over continued existence, or for continued existence would consist of only suffering, has great prima facie appeal, and that we could appeal to that as a kind of axiom in our system. And I'm sympathetic to debunkings of our intuitions in first-order moral judgments or first-order normative cases. I'm less sympathetic to debunking arguments for first-order for first principles. Now, I also don't think that anything I said assumes that intuitionism is true or foundationalist epistemology is true. As far as I can tell, it's consistent with coherentism or any kind of plausible epistemology. Not that you said that it was, but I'm just trying to make a point that I was trying to cast my net as widely as possible and not make too many controversial epistemological assumptions. You also raised the issue that there's this kind of epistemic problem. The cases might be unrealistic because the agent doesn't know for certain what would happen if they didn't die at the time in question. And that's a good point. So I should have been clear about this. I was talking about what are sometimes called an agent's objective reasons, and those are just determined by what the reason constituting facts are. And that's irrespective both of what the agent believes those facts are and what her evidence indicates that those facts are. So to give a kind of like common sense example, suppose a doctor sees somebody who badly needs a shot of penicillin, or would if it weren't the case that she were allergic to the penicillin. You can ask whether the doctor has reason to give her a shot of penicillin. Well, it seems like the doctor might have subjective reason to give the patient a shot of penicillin, because relative to her evidence, there's no reason that she could pick up on. There's no reason in her epistemic cansos that would prohibit giving a shot of penicillin, on the contrary. But she has objective reason to. If she were aware of all the relevant reason constituting facts, like giving a shot of penicillin would just make the patient worse, then she would recognize that she ought not to give the agent a shot of penicillin. So I was just talking about objective reasons here, and if people don't like that talk between objective and subjective reasons, then I can just stipulate in the examples that the agent is aware of what would happen to them if they didn't die at the time in question. And even if they can't be certain, we have to make judgments all the time about whether we should seek death or not. So when people are contemplating undergoing euthanasia, they're taking into account facts about what they think are very likely to happen if they continue to exist. And usually when they seek euthanasia, it's because they justifiably believe that they would just suffer if they didn't die at the time in question. So even if we don't have absolute certainty, we can talk about what agents should do to maximize their expected utility. But all of that kind of complicates the discussion, so I was just trying to focus on objective reasons, but I should have been clearer about that. Now, you suggest that you might lose a kind of practical part of Epicureanism if we say that it's trivially distinct from the mere deprivation view. I'm not sure exactly what you mean when you say that Epicureanism is a practical theory in a way that deprivation views are not. As I understand it, Lucretius and Epicurus were historically interested in addressing concerns that people had that death was intrinsically bad. So in Lucretius's epic poem, he would talk about how people would look at corpses and see bugs in the corpses, and they would impose feelings that they would have as a corpse. And the tedium of not existing for immortality, they were imagining falsely that would somehow be something that would be experienced with death. As I understand it, Epicurus and Lucretius were primarily interested in getting rid of that fear. And if it's practical in that sense, then deprivation views can say the same thing. They can say your death isn't intrinsically bad for you, just like being in a non-existence was not intrinsically bad for you. Just like being in a coma when you're unconscious is not intrinsically bad for you. But I think I might just be missing the force of the point. So you correct me on that if I'm mistaken. Now, perhaps some Epicureans might want to say that we should never fear death or never regard it as extrinsically or intrinsically bad, at least contemporary Epicureans. Some crazy ones might want to say that. And furthermore, because of this, one never has any reason to avoid or seek death. And that might be practical in a way, but I find those views implausible for the reasons that I gave in this paper. So even if it brings somebody comfort or gives them a very clear decision procedure about how to act with respect to death, you gain this kind of practicality at the expense of doing something that I think is really bad for you sometimes and having false beliefs. But importantly, I think deprivation views offer a very practical alternative, something that that a lot of people would be better off if they accepted deprivation views. So even though they're formulated in terms of objective reasons, we can appeal to subjective reasons, those that are relative to the evidence or in the epistemic canon, to generate the following decision procedure about death. So all other things being equal, avoid death if, relative to your evidence, your continued existence would be worth living. All other things being equal, seek death if, relative to your evidence, your continued existence would not be worth living. So if somebody's trying to decide whether or not they should undergo euthanasia, there's a kind of practical principle that they could get from the deprivation view that would help them make very hard decisions about whether or not they should die. Yeah, I'm not sure how effective that would be, but I think there's something to that. Now, you suggest that appropriate attitudes towards death are very closely tied to the badness of death. So if we get rid of the talk of the badness of death, then we're losing something in this kind of substantive debate about appropriate attitudes. And I think it's true that there's an assumed intimate connection between the badness of death and appropriate attitudes towards it. Generally, I take the assumption to be that one should lament her death if and only if it is bad for her, or lament her death for self-regarded reasons if and only if it's bad for her. Call this a nothing bad, nothing to lament assumption. And actually I have a paper where I argue that deprivation views cannot accommodate this assumption. They cannot accommodate the view that your death is only lamentable if and only if it's bad for you. And that's because of overdetermination cases. Those are cases where two events would bring about somebody's death very soon. So if somebody is a teenager and they're hit by a bus and they die, and what would have happened if they didn't die from being hit by a bus is they would have had an aneurysm 1 moment later. Deprivation views say that that person's death was hardly bad for them at all. It just deprived them of a second of life. But I argue that nevertheless this assumption is false. So it's not too bad for deprivation views. It's not going to be a bad consequence for Epicurean views that are deprivation views. Now, I also don't think Epicureans can accommodate this assumption either. So Taylor might want to allow that death is lamentable if it's a harm to the deceased. And Green should want to allow that death can be lamentable if it results in less good for a person than can reasonably be expected, and so on. So, actually, although there's this assumed connection between how bad your death is for you and the attitudes you should have towards it, I don't think contemporary Epicureans want to accommodate that assumption either. I think they want to say sometimes agents have reason to feel bad about the fact that they're going to die, even though their death isn't bad for them. Now, if I'm right in thinking that these two views are often involved in mere verbal disputes, then debates about the appropriate attitudes towards death are often obfuscated by inconsistent uses of the terms harm, bad for, good for, etc. Just generally, the debate is muddied by using terms in different ways. So once we get past the mere verbal dispute, we can really enter into the debate about appropriate attitudes towards death, more or less in common. Now about the existence condition. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, no Epicurean claims that agents can be harmed by events while they exist, which they cannot even in principle experience. So it's true that some Epicureans want to allow that things can be bad for you even if you don't experience them. But they want this generally, as far as I can tell, want this in principle distinction in there. So maybe if you're in a relationship, infidelity would be bad, or if somebody lies to you, that would be bad. Even if you don't experience, but it's something that you could in principle experience because you exist at the time in question. Now, called this principle the experience condition. John Martin Fisher, who does a lot of work on death, suggests that Epicureans treat the experience condition as explanatorily prior to the existence condition. So why do they think that agents have to exist at the time when they're harmed? Well, John Martin Fisher thinks it's because they're assuming that the experience condition is true, that the agent has to at least be able to, in principle, experience the harm. Now, given various conceptions of harm, whether the existence condition is true is an interesting and is a substantive question, but deprivationalists can accept the existence condition, too. So this is something that often gets overlooked. People, when they think of deprivationalism, think that it's necessarily tied with subsequentism. I mispronounced that, but they necessarily assume that if your death is bad for you, it's bad for you at the time when it exists. But deprivation views don't have to assume that. You could accept priorism. You could, if you're a deprivationalist, accept that your death is bad for you before it happens. Some people do. You could accept concurrentism, which some people do, like Lord Jones, that your death is bad for you at the time that you die, which would be the existence condition. Or indefinitism, that your death is bad for you, but it's not bad for you at any particular time. And that would still allow them to accept the existence condition, because as far as I can tell, the existence condition is harm can only be bad for you at time t if the agent exists at time t. So death isn't something that's ever bad for you at time t if you accept indefinitism. It's just harm that's not bad for you at any point in time. So it seems to me that whether or not the existence condition is true, and whether or not it's explanatorily prior to the experience condition, any particular Epicurean view that accommodates my desideratum will be involved in a mere verbal dispute with a particular deprivation view. Nevertheless, there can be substantive disagreements about whether or not the experience condition is true, whether or not the existence condition is true, whether or not priorism, concurrentism, or definitism is true. Those I don't want to say are really verbal disputes. Okay. About Feldman's existence condition. So deprivation views can distinguish between these different types of harms too. They don't have to accept monism about value. And they can hold that the value of death is different from the value of other events if they want to. So the fact that an agent ceases to exist after death might make that harm different from any other type of intrinsic or non-experiential harm, perhaps. And there's nothing in the deprivation view that prevents them from accepting that. Now, likewise, an Epicurean view could, if they wanted, treat death similar to other types of harm. So I don't think Epicureans generally accept monism. They could. They could say that events that bring about less good are relatively similar to events that are bad for agents. And ditto for harms 2 and harms 4, and ditto for any distinction you want to make. But I don't think Epicureans generally do that. And then the last thing is the dilemma that you pose. This is interesting. I'm going to have to think about this more, but this is kind of my initial response to it. So I think the debate between monism and pluralism is a substantive one. I don't want to deny that. So for any Epicurean view that accepts pluralism and any deprivation view that accepts monism of value, there's going to be a substantive debate. But that's going to be about the debate between monism and pluralism of value, not about whether some Epicurean view is true or some deprivation view is true. So if you take a particular deprivation view that accepts monism of value, you can translate that into an Epicurean view that accepts monism of value. For any Epicurean view that accepts pluralism, you can translate that into a deprivation view that accepts pluralism as well. So the substantive part of that debate cuts across Epicureanism and deprivationism. Now you write that the problem with taking the option is that since the reasons why we separate the two types of value is an essential condition of Epicureanism, then contrary to what the title of the article suggests, the only plausible forms of deprivationism are, at least in this point, Epicureanism in disguise. Yeah, that's fair enough. So I don't think you have to accept pluralism of value to be an Epicurean, but it might be that all Epicureans say, no, I accept pluralism. And then deprivation views that agree with just Epicurean views in disguise. That's fine. I'm not committed to saying that Epicurean views are deprivation views in disguise or deprivation views are Epicurean views in disguise. So that's a consequence that I'm perfectly happy to accept. Then you add, but the deprivationalists can take the other option and claim that his conflict is with the other way we value things, with an existing subject involved. In this case, the Epicurean has the existence condition to defend that in the case of death, we are actually doing the other way of valuing things. And then the conflict is, again, not merely verbal, but is said about the best way to understand our moral evaluation of death. Right, so again, I think there would be a substantive dispute between this particular deprivation view and that particular Epicurean view. The disagreement is not about whether some deprivation view is true or some Epicurean view is true. It's about whether some conception of harm in the existence condition is true. And I want to grant that those are substantive debates, but using the term harm differently obfuscates that. Prevents people from seeing the real kind of substance at issue here. So yeah, that's the initial way I would respond to that. So thanks again for your very helpful comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Travis. Well, let's start the question round. If you have a question, raise your hand for my colleagues. Yeah. First. You're first. Please.
So, first I want to say I thought it was a really nice argumentative strategy, shifting to this question about reasons and how the Epicurean can accommodate the reasons for action. But I had a question about the next move, which is the implicit assumption of comparativism. So, the way you define comparativism is you can have a self-regarding reason to bring about or avoid an event, if and only if there's a shift in the net receipt of intrinsic goods or harms. And it seems from there it's natural to think that, provided that Epicurean, at least that gives us a reason, it's going to have to be cashed out in something that will either be a harm or could be redefined as a harm. But it seems to me that, at least for a lot of people, there are other self-regarding reasons that might not have to do with the net receipt of intrinsic goods and harms. So some people think it's not just the net weighing of goods and harms, but the temporal structure, right? So there might be something better about a life that starts bad and winds up good than a life that starts good and winds up disastrous, even if you have the same net weight of goods and harms. Or a life that minimizes the terrible harms even if it doesn't maximize the net weight, right? So there's lots of different things other than net maximization that you might have reasons to do insofar as you're concerned about well-being. But more broadly, right, well-being might be a function of harms and goods, but it might not be a simple function of just maximizing it. But then it's not clear to me if that's what we're thinking and not sort of this narrower comparativism. So if the Epicurean thinks death gives us a reason to avoid certain actions, because the overall structure of our well-being would be that, but not because we have more net harm and good, then it seems to me it's not as clear that it's going to be translatable in the way that we just reduced to a mere verbal dispute.
Right, okay. Good, that's very helpful, and I think that's right. So I don't think all Epicurean views assume comparativism, and for the reasons that you listed. And I don't think deprivation views need to assume comparativism either, at least if they accept, if you take a particular deprivation view like Ben Bradley's, and then you couple it with an account of well-being where you think the narrative structure, that's how good agent's life is for the agent, then that deprivation view is going to have to reject comparativism too. So what I think I should do is just deny the claim that Epicureans assume comparativism and that deprivationists necessarily accept comparativism. I think most of them do, but they needn't. All that needs to be the case is that they think that the agent's self-regarding reasons to bring about avoidment of E, at least in part, is determined by the extent that S is total net receipt in terms of goods or intrinsic E would be greater or smaller if you not compare. You take out the if and only if. And that's not going to be comparativism in any kind of meaningful sense at that point, but it's something that both views accept. And I think debates about narrative structure and well-being are substantive, but they don't, they're not exclusive to deprivation views or Epicurean views as far as I can. So yeah, thank you. That's
Thank you. Professor Shapiro?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk, and I like the idea. A couple of things I wanted to ask you about or talk to you about, and if I don't get to both of them, I'll do it later. I've really gotten interested myself in verbal disputes lately for all kinds of other reasons, and it's a really interesting topic. And I've had some correspondence with Hirsch about this, with trying to run my examples by him and so on. And it turns out that it seems to me that applying his test, I think both you and Rodrigo are onto this, but it's worth stating anyway. It's not as easy as the example looks. I mean, Hirsch sets it up, the verbal dispute thing, with an example where by stipulation it's just one word.
right.
But then if you're looking at it, I don't want to call this a real life example, I guess it's a sort of a more substantial example. You've got connections all over the place, and in order to get the thing to come out verbal, you have to sort of make adjustments from both sides, and that's sort of what you and sort of Rodrigo were talking about. And if you can make the adjustments in the right way, then it can come out to be verbal, but these are all optional moves on the part of both parties. Does that sort of summarize at least from this perspective,
Yeah,
sort of what you're up to?
right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's right. Wherever that problem, I think Chalmers provides a nice kind of heuristic where to try to get at the heart of what the issue is remove the term in question and then try to explain.
Yeah,
Do you not like that?
For the real cases I'm interested in, like for example logical terms, you just can't do that.
Yeah, right.
Right. Take the word and or not out of the language and see what you get.
Right.
But that's my case, not yours.
Right. So he recognizes that these kind of like just basic concepts that we have that.
Yeah, well, that is kind of basic or bedrock is his phrase, but the problem is that these things are all going to ramify. So what would be the word we would take out in this case?
In the
good,
yeah.
right?
Right.
What ought? Right. Well, you can't just take that out because good is connected with that. And so if you take all this stuff out, yeah, then maybe but there isn't just much left to say. That's well, I mean, obviously you could say plenty. You could say that Mexico City is in Mexico and stuff like that, but nothing that's relevant to to this particular discussion.
Right. So I was hoping that we could take out claims about different types of harms and things being good or bad for the agent and talk about the agent's reasons. I think reasons are kind of a fundamental term in Epicureans and deprivation systems. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly how that would work out because a lot of the Epicurean views aren't stated precisely enough to answer these questions, so I'd have to.
Well, that's exactly the problem, right? And you can articulate it in various ways and get it to come out verbal.
Right.
But some of them will and some of them won't.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So the general strategy that I wanted was there's different ways to persistify types of Epicureanism by supplementing accounts of well-being, or there's different ways that could respond to questions about what reasons an agent has.
Right.
And then I want the 2 points. So either you say the same thing as the deprivation you said, and you get this desideratum, and then you're involved in your verbal dispute.
Right.
Or you don't.
Or you
And
don't.
then you should reject that.
And that, of course, focuses the dispute where it ought to be focused on that other thing.
Right.
Which, of course, is a big plus in the the overall debate.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so then maybe talk about the other thing, if I can take a minute. This isn't in your topic, but it seems to be not unrelated to it. Intuitively, you can have duties to people that are dead. So if somebody if I promise someone to do something for him after he dies, and then he dies, and then I don't do it, well, intuitively, I guess, most of the parties here will be committed to saying I haven't harmed the person, or at least the Epicureans will. But then what is wrong about it? This is part of the original thought that I had, that sort of everything is connected to everything else. Right. So either they might say, no, there's no problem there, you can do what you want to after you promised, the dead person. That's counterintuitive. Is that connected to this, or?
Yeah, so it's definitely connected to that, and I think that questions about what obligations we have for that are very complicated and very interesting. Some Epicureans can allow that we do have obligations to do that, not because we would be harming the dead, but because it might be
for some harm
to, or yeah.
Then if the idea is that, they're also, I presume they're also going to be utilitarians, so then you have to sort of cash it all out in terms of utility. And if it's obviously not that person's utility, then, you know.
Right, so utilitarians are gonna, who are Epicureans, might have different views
Right.
from Epicureans who are not utilitarians,
Fair enough.
who are Aristotelian or something.
Yeah.
And, but they're not gonna have different views from, necessarily from utilitarians who are deprivation
Right.
accounts. So I think the strategy that Epicureans are gonna wanna adopt is whatever a strategy the particular Epicurean adopts to try to say that killing somebody is wrong. And a lot of them want to say it's even, killing is wrong even though it's not bad for the person that you're killing, even though nobody else thinks it.
Well, that's a more focused example, than mine, but, they get sort of duties to the person, right, that occur later. Yeah, presumably, intuitively, it'd be wrong to kill them, even if they didn't want to be killed, even if, their future is, has nothing but harm in it for them.
Right, right. And that's an interesting, important question. In order to do that, we need to get into issues about well-being and correct normative ethical view.
Right.
And that's where the real kind of substance of the debate lies.
Right.
Not whether we're talking about whether the person is harmed if we kill them or if it just causes them to have less good in their lives. If they both say it's bad because the deprivation says you harm them because you deprive them of X number of years of happy life, the Epicurean says it's bad because you bring about less good for X number of years of happy life. Or they could both say people have rights. I mean, that's what some Epicureans do. Even though it's not bad for them, they're violating their rights. And deprivationalists can say the same thing.
And you could say that even after and the rights continue even after, so then they can have rights after they die, even though they don't have rights and duties to them after they die, even though they can't.
Yeah, so I think the idea is they have the right to life and you violate that at the moment that you kill them. Even
I was thinking the other example, they have a right to have the promise,
Oh yeah, you could say that too, yeah, it depends on what the rights that the agent has, and that's another subject.
So I'm violating, so if I break the promise, I'm violating a right that they have, but not harming them.
Yeah, that's what somebody can say, right? And deprivation is to say the same thing. I mean, Ben Bradley's particular understanding is that you're not harming anybody if you don't fulfill promises after they die. So
at least not as such, I mean, for other reasons you might be, but not for just not fulfilling the promise.
Right.
For example, under Sesión and Martinus will say that you're not being virtuous, you're actually harming somebody, but you're not harming the person, but you're harming yourself by not being virtuous. That's the way she defends Epicureanism.
That kind of begs the question, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm not convinced by that view, but that's a substantive issue, is whether you're harming yourself.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's move to the last question, please.
So this is maybe just a theoretical difference. From your initial characterization of Epicureanism, it seems like there are two moving parts in Epicureanism. So there's a thesis that death is not bad for the dead person, and there's the thesis that being dead is not bad for the dead person, and then there's a thesis that future death is not bad for the person who's gonna die. So I have two related questions. One is whether Epicurean can accommodate some of the intuitions we discussed by dropping one or the other of two claims, or maybe not both of them. And the other is, so corresponding to these two claims, there are going to be two different versions of deprivationalism. One that says that death is indeed bad for the person who's already dead, because it deprives that person of goods you would have if she were alive. And the other that says that that is indeed harmful prior to its occurrence. So do you think that after making those conciliatory moves, Epicureanism becomes like just a notational variant of the first or the second version of deprivation?
Yeah, good. So I think it would become a notational variant of a deprivation view that accepts priorism about the badness of death.
Sorry, what's
I thought it would be a notational variant of a deprivation view that accepts priorism.
So that the view that death is bad before it occurs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it deprives you of, and that's bad because it deprives you of good human experience.
So you there's no in this debate no one occupies the slot that says, death is indeed bad also for the dead person.
No one says that death is bad for the dead person?
Yeah, that's the other view. I mean, we've been assuming that death is lack of existence. In that case, I mean, it's a very radical view about what that is, because that would make trivially true on some views that nothing can be bad for X, because if there's no X, nothing can be true of it. So in particular, it cannot be true that something is bad for it. But if we assume more moderate views about that, I don't know, maybe that when you die, you lose many of your interesting properties, but you're still something that I can quantify over, then there is this respectable position that says that a dead person is something for which thing can be good or bad. And in particular, being dead can be a bad thing for that thing. So there is not a position that you're saying Epicureans would get closer to.
Oh yeah, so I think that's a good question. I'm not aware of any Epicureans that accept that. But that's not to say you could come up with an Epicurean view. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm not sure what the constitutive conditions of being an Epicurean view are. It might just be, in order to be accurately described as an Epicurean view, you have to say that in some sense your death isn't bad for you. But if they're mere notational variants of analog deprivation views, then it doesn't really matter whether it's called an Epicurean view or some deprivation view. I'm not aware of anybody that accepts a view about the badness of death that you just gave, but that's not to say they couldn't. And as far as I can tell, I don't see any reason to think that you couldn't have a deprivation view and an Epicurean view that are mere notational variants of one another that accept all of the substantive claims that they made.
But just to be clear on this point, so as you see, the debate rests on the agreement about what Rodrigo called the existence condition. So everyone agrees that that is not bad for the dead person, and the disagreement is just about whether it's a verbal disagreement or not. It's a disagreement about the badness of future death.
So Epicureans agree about the existence condition given their particular conception of harm. So given the way that they use the term harm. Deprivationists can also agree with the existence condition of their harm. But I think given deprivation's account of harm, or some understanding of harm, then some Epicureans might be required to reject the existence condition. It's depending on which conception of harm is appealed to in the formulation of the existence condition. Did that answer your question? I feel like.
Thank you. Any question? Okay. Well, thank you so much for this, Rodrigo. Thank you for coming. We invite you to come to our keynote conference of Professor Plausible at 12 o'clock here.